Awesome. I think folks are rolling in here, so we'll go ahead and get started. But thank you for everybody for joining us for today's webinar, Trump's Foreign Policy, Brand Risk, and the Global Perception of U.S. Business. We have a great panel here to chat with everybody today, and we're excited to dive in. My name's Cooper Hardy. I sit on our syndicated data side of the business here at Morning Consult, and I'm joined by my colleagues Jason McMahon, who's our head of global intelligence, and Sonnet Frisbee, who's a principal of global intelligence here at Morning Consult. Just to tee up what we'll be covering today from an agenda standpoint, we'll give you a quick introduction to our intelligence here at Morning Consult. We'll then dive directly into the analysis, looking at global views surrounding Venezuela and Greenland tensions and the implications for U.S. brands. And we'll save some time at the end for a Q&A session with our experts. And then we'll have a few closing remarks and then can chat through how to get access to this data if anyone is interested in doing so. Excellent. And we'll just dive in quickly here just to contextualize what we'll be talking about this afternoon. But it's no secret that the world is changing rapidly around us. And what we firmly believe here at Morning Consult is that global volatility demands a clear early warning system for all businesses. As events develop and change, as we think about Venezuela, as we think about Greenland, as we think about American brands around the world, right? The number one way to support your business and to navigate these times is to have early and leading indicators of what is happening in real time and how those things are changing the behaviors and the perceptions of consumers. How we actually support this work here at Morning Consult and what will be the foundation of the conversation we have today. We've actually created a global proprietary data set that maps the ecosystem of human behavior. What we mean by that is we talk to about 30,000 people every single day in over 45 countries around the world. That means we have a tremendous repository of historical data to look at trends and changes over time to the tune of 100 million plus historical survey interviews. And it means we have an incredible level of granularity when it comes to about 6 billion answered questions here at Morning Consult. As we collect this data, we're asking individuals questions about economics. We're asking them questions about politics and about brands and their behaviors and how their behaviors are changing. This allows us to create a complete picture of who these consumers are, how things are changing in the world, and provide a clear level of insight into what is actually happening at a macro level and how is that changing decision-making among consumers at a micro level. What we also recognize is that this always-on consumer signal and this incredible wealth of data is only as impactful as the clarity we can provide and the access individuals can gain to it. What we've done is we've created this global data collection. We're looking at consumer data in real time. We're supporting leading organizations around the world who are accessing all of this data through a fully AI native platform to answer the questions that are most pressing, most concerning, and most impactful to their business every single day. My colleagues Sonnet and Jason will walk through a very distinct set of this data when it comes to our political analysis. But we wanted to just tee up this conversation to say this is where the data is coming from, and this is how individuals can actually leverage this in a meaningful and impactful way. So I'll pass it over to Jason to tee up the rest of this conversation, but we look forward to diving in.
Thanks so much, Cooper. Very nice to meet you all. For anyone who's new to Morning Consult, as Cooper mentioned at the top, my name is Jason McMahon, and I'm the head of global intelligence here at the company. We wanted to kick things off just with a really straightforward map slide, which will give you a sense of the 45, soon to be about 50 countries where we conduct the daily surveys that Cooper was walking through on the previous slides. So in terms of country coverage, really most of the G20 plus the next largest 25 or so emerging and frontier markets, with those that you see listed in that list in pink in the bottom right, coming soon to our data collection platform as well. Just really quickly, in terms of what we survey on in these markets, as I'm sure many of you know, we conduct a lot of questions or surveys rather on individual brands. So, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion toward them? What are these brands' reputation, and so on and so forth, among consumers every single day in all of these markets. But alongside of that information, we also collect a lot of political data metrics. And the one that we'll be talking about the most today is what we call our country favorability data metric. When it comes to country favorability, essentially what we do is in the United States, for example, we go ahead and ask, how do you feel about the United Kingdom? Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of it compared to France, compared to Germany, China, and so on and so forth? And then in all of those other places, China, for example, we'd ask the inverse. So, how do you feel about the United States versus France, Germany, Argentina, and so on? And often what we'll do with that metric is we'll transform it on a net basis and sometimes take either a global or regional average of it to really give you a sense of what quote unquote brand USA might look like on average. So, how do consumers across the world really think about the United States? And then, in turn, by pairing that with our reputation data, we can then give a sense of to what degree could something like rising anti-Americanism impact the reputation of US brands that are really global in scope. So, doing business among overseas consumers and who are worried that America's rising or falling fortunes could impact consumers' interest in buying goods and services from them. So, with no further ado, if we could go on to the next slide, we'll jump into the substantive portion of the presentation today. As you see here, we note, to no one's great surprise, that 2026 certainly started with a bang. We saw the U.S. intervention in Venezuela a few weeks ago, followed more recently by U.S. tensions surrounding the potential acquisition of Greenland. And amid these dynamics, really just wanted to give you a sense today of how views of the United States are trending at the moment among global consumers and what we think some of the reputational risks could be for brands doing business in different markets globally. If you could go to the next slide, we wanted to kick things off just with a look at global average net favorability toward the United States, going back about 2 years at this point in time. So you'll see here that if we look at that line from 2024 into January of 2025, it was pretty flat and it was pretty positive. And essentially what that indicated to us is that the average global consumer thought America was a decent country at that point in time. If you fast forward into early 2025, there's where we start to see a bit of a dip. And we have a few events called out here for you on the chart. The first one would be Inauguration Day with Trump's victory on Election Day preceding that. And as you'll see at that point in time, it really wasn't either of those events that caused a dip in global average views of the United States. Most of the dip that we see came a few months after that. And it started from February into March when the Trump administration moved to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China and really took a turn for the worse when we got into April around a lot of those Liberation Day tariff announcements. If you look from April onwards, as those tariffs were kind of on again and then off again and then stabilized a bit later in the year, we see views of the United States, so America's reputation in this case, start to rebound. And then if we fast forward just to about the past few weeks, we've seen another major dip timed almost to the day of when the Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro was ousted, followed by a lot of these renewed tensions targeting Greenland. So we like to use that just to set the stage when it comes to what anti-Americanism looks nowadays and give you a little bit of historical context about how that's trended over time. On the next slide, we'll take another look at this same data point, but here you'll see another line on the chart, which is this pink line. Essentially, that line is global average net favorability toward China. And the really striking thing here that we like to use to contextualize how the US is looking nowadays is that really, no matter how far back in time we go in the history of our data tracking, this is the very first time when we've seen China's reputation among global consumers outpace that of the United States. The other interesting thing we like to highlight here is that it's not so much that there's been a sudden rise in China's fortunes. You'll see that pink line has kind of trended upwards gradually over the past couple of years, but it's really the dip in views of the US that is doing most of the work here. So we'll use that to set the global stage and wanted to pivot now in a more targeted manner to look at how things have been trending in Latin America. So we survey among about 6 countries in the region, and we wanted to look there to get a sense of if you look at the countries among consumers in the vicinity of Venezuela, how are they feeling about Brand USA nowadays? And what we've seen here is a bit of a mixed bag. So each of these trend lines in this case is net favorability toward the United States among consumers in Latin America. And here we're looking specifically at Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, as well as Mexico and Peru, with that vertical line again representing the date on which Maduro was ousted from office and taken to the United States. And in terms of the mixed bag side of things, you'll see there's a fair amount of volatility to the right of that vertical line. We see a few markets where views of the US are kind of flatlining, a couple others where anti-Americanism seems to tick up a little bit, but there isn't so much in the way of a clear trend overall. There are a couple markets we would call out for you here. The first would be those with left-leaning governments. These tend to be the ones where we saw a bit more of a consistent dip. So if you look at that red line for Chile, for example, we see a bit of a dip after Maduro was ousted, although it's a bit of a unique case in that their government is changing soon. The more notable dip would be Mexico, which is that gold line at the bottom there, and that's where we've seen the most pronounced and consistent dip in the region so far. So if you are a US brand and you're doing business in the region, Mexico is the market that we would really advise watching at this point in time, in part due to that dip and in part because it's also just a relatively large consumer market. For the moment, that's where we would expect any risks, kind of knock-on risks arising from anti-Americanism for US brands to be most pronounced. The other market potentially worth watching would be Brazil, and you'll see that indicated in the chart with this darkish purple line here. The thing we note there is that views declined in the aftermath of Maduro's ouster, but they were also declining a bit before amid some of this tariff angst going back and forth between the two countries. So we would advise keeping an eye on it, again, simply because it's a really large and currently left-leaning market. But we would caution that the shift in views really predates Maduro's ouster, as there are likely just other dynamics taking place for that market specifically. On the next slide, we wanted to pivot back once again to a regional look in this case and give you a sentiment of how movement in the Americas really stacks up with how consumers are shifting their views in other regions at this point in time. So, same metric here, net favorability toward the United States, but in this case by region, with that pink line towards the top representing the Americas. And what you'll see if you look there relative to the other regions is that the Americas actually had a relatively muted overall average decline compared to places like Europe, which would be that green line at the bottom. Part of the reason for this that we've kind of highlighted for other clients is that there was really no love lost toward Maduro in the Americas to begin with in many quarters. So on the one hand, while people may be not thrilled with the US attitude of kind of renewed intervention in the region, they may also not be so upset that Maduro is gone. So just something to keep in mind again in terms of adding some of the historical context to why that line seems relatively flat. In Europe, by contrast, we're seeing a pretty large dip. You'll see there that dip is above about 10 points total, which is relatively large compared to other dips we've seen over the past year. The only time in recent history that we've seen a dip of that magnitude has been when these reciprocal tariffs were implemented by the United States, or at least first announced back on April 2nd, and you'll see that in the bottom left portion of this chart. Part of the reason we think this line is declining so much is not just that Europeans were unhappy with what took place in Venezuela, but also almost to the day since that intervention, we've also seen the Trump administration really ramp up its rhetoric when it comes to a potential US acquisition of Greenland, either by military or negotiated means. So we think it's kind of a double whammy here. Again, not just the Venezuela incident, probably a little bit more so Greenland at this point in time, certainly as we get farther away from January 3rd. But if you are doing business in Europe and in other regions as a US brand, we really advise keeping your attention focused on Europe for the moment, given the relatively large magnitude of the decline that we're seeing in that market. If you could go to the next slide, here we'll just zoom in once again, and we wanted to give you a sense of how things are looking in some of the larger European markets. So here again, we're looking at net favorability toward the United States among key European consumer markets. We've got France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. And if you think back to a few slides earlier where we saw kind of those jumbled lines for the Latin American markets, here the trends are quite a bit clearer, where in almost all of these markets, you're seeing a pretty sharp downturn on the order of 10 to 20 points since Maduro's ouster and since the Greenland tensions ramped up. If you look at France in particular, you'll see quite a large drop there on the order of about 15 points. That is, I think, the largest we've seen at this point in time with this data current through January 20th, so just a couple days earlier this week. France, for anybody who's following the news, has been sort of the Trump administration's largest antagonist when it comes to some of the Greenland tensions, particularly surrounding his speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where Macron was really not thrilled with the line that the U.S. was pursuing when it came to a potential acquisition of Greenland. So, despite the fact that military tensions seem, at least for now, to be off the table as things move forward, We would recommend keeping an eye on pretty much all of these large European consumer markets in the weeks ahead. As you saw with the tariff dispute earlier in the year, views of the US did tend to rebound in the ensuing months, but they did stay low for quite some time, and our expectations are similar this time around as well. If we can move on to the next slide here, this is where we'll really start to make the link between anti-Americanism and how we think it will affect both individual brands and brands grouped by industry. So I will pass it over to my colleague, Sonnet Frisbee, to take things forward from here.
Thanks, Jason. If you look at this chart, each of these white dots represents a US company that is active in multiple overseas markets. So what this chart shows you is we've been able to help you quantify, because I think most American brands sort of intuitively understand or can buy into the idea that brand USA, the reputation of the United States, could impact you overseas. But then the question is, well, how much, and especially how much relative to my competitors or people in my industry? And so we have taken the correlation. So how tight is the relationship between views globally of the United States and then views of given brands. And then we've plotted that across different industries. So each of the white dots, as I said, is a different company. And then those vertical bars each represent an industry that you can see along the bottom there. And that purple bar that you see in each of those in those categories is the average for that industry. So a really interesting picture, I think, starts to emerge where you can see that certain industries, which would be on the far left, have much higher what we call country affinity. So I think it's no surprise that sort of innovative industries like technology, consumer electronics, enterprise technology, social media, even automotive are seen as very American around the world. So as you're looking at this and you're looking at where you might fall in which industry, it gives you sort of a general sense of how exposed your reputation might be to brand risks across markets. I will say we've also done quite a bit of work sort of modeling different shocks that we've seen in the global economy due to geopolitical risks using this metric, and it's highly predictive if there is US involvement in a geopolitical event in a given market. How much is my brand relative to be hit relative to other brands in my industry? So we can go to the next slide. I hope that that gives you a sense of sort of why we're talking so much about Brand USA and how that relates directly to your brand. And we've talked a lot about, as Jason sort of was giving you the global view, but we also wanted to look at how Americans themselves are feeling about some of these issues, because obviously the US itself is many of your most important market. So specifically on Venezuela, we've gotten the question, how do Americans feel about US companies going in and working, for example, in the Venezuelan oil and gas sector? And what we see might surprise you. It's sort of a tentative green light. So many Americans say that US companies should invest. And if you look at that top bar where you see all respondents, so US adults, more Americans than not are in favor of US companies being involved. You can then see the party breakout. Unsurprisingly, Republicans are more in favor, Democrats are more opposed. And at this bottom highlighted bar, that's what we're calling a policy active audience. So to the extent that you are someone who's thinking more about decision makers or people involved in policy, we narrowed it down to respondents who were involved in sort of a range of policy activities in their day-to-day and asked them. So what I want to call out here is that gray bars on the right-hand side, that's people who are unsure. And that's pretty large for sort of just your average American. People sort of say like, tentative green light, but I could be swayed. I'm really not sure what to think about this. That policy active audience is both more sure and more in favor of US companies being active in the oil and gas sector in Venezuela. Next slide, please. Pivoting to Greenland, since of course Venezuela now seems like it was a long time ago, even though we're only 3 weeks into the new year. So with Greenland tensions, what we see is a lot more clear-cut opposition to the US sort of taking these more aggressive actions. So even sort of peaceful things like buying Greenland or exerting only economic pressure or trade leverage are seeing pretty strong opposition. And you'll see that dark red is strongly opposed. So there's really a clear consensus among the US public that the way that we're trying to go about acquiring Greenland is not necessarily something that they would like to see. And then, of course, military action sees very strong opposition. Okay, next slide. And then if we force people to choose between prioritizing acquiring Greenland for national security and prioritizing maintaining strong relationships with our European allies, it's overwhelmingly the US public is in favor of maintaining those strong relationships. So it's kind of an indicator that that national security rhetoric that we're hearing from the administration is kind of falling flat, because I think most Americans are saying, well, our European allies are an important part of our national security. Maybe I'll say one more thing about this, and that's that as you're watching congressional action and congressional responses to some of these issues, public opinion, I think, is playing into some of the actions, especially with midterms coming up. So in contrast to Venezuela, we did actually see a fair bit of GOP opposition to the Greenland rhetoric. And I think a lot of it is because this clear-cut US public opinion is sort of feeding into lawmakers' opinions on these issues. Next slide. Okay, so we've given you sort of the international view, the US view. I want to end with a little bit of a silver lining. This metric is a political risk index, which measures how people are feeling internal to their own country about the political trajectory. So how are they feeling about their incumbent government, and how are they feeling about the overall trajectory of their country? So despite all of these geopolitical risks that we're seeing, a bit of a tumultuous start to 2026, that vertical line that we've put in is January 2025, and the chart ends at January 2026. So what I want to call out for you is higher is better, lower is bad. And so we actually see an increase in sort of, or I guess I would say a decrease in political risk, a better outlook for people's opinions on their national government. So inter-country geopolitical risk, we're in a bit of a tumultuous period. And yet we have actually seen an improvement in consumer sentiment about their own governments, which was not the case in 2024 and much of 2025. So a little bit of a silver lining. We often use this to predict sort of policy stability in many of these countries, the likelihood of a government changing over or major policy change. In somewhere like France, for example, the government collapsing. And so I think this is a potential bit of good news for multinationals that are active in many markets. Overall, that picture is looking a little bit better. That is the content that we had for you. You can go to the next slide. And we're going to be moving into Q&A, which we have a moderator who's going to help us field those questions.
Awesome. Great stuff, Jason and Sonnet. Thank you. We can dive into some that have been dropped in the chat. And if folks have other questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A and we'll address them. The first question that came in is the rising anti-American sentiment impacting purchasing intent from consumers in Europe and other regions where the negative sentiment is high?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one, Cooper. And it also ties into another question we received, which was just kind of how America's net favorability is correlated or affecting US business impact in some way. And I think the closest analogy we have here at this point in time is we had done an exercise back in, I guess, March through April of 2025 when a lot of these tariffs started to roll out, initially targeting Canada, China, and Mexico. So US tariffs on those markets. And essentially what we wanted to see is in that window, if you did kind of a pre and post comparison, so sort of take a month on either side, what happened to consumers' stated purchase consideration in those countries for consumers who would consider buying US goods and services, kind of from large US multinationals. And the good news there is that when we look on average across, say, a couple hundred brands in each of these markets, the hit to purchase consideration was relatively small or negligible, often on the order of 0 to say -2 or -3 points. So really not a massive downturn, more of just a blip on the radar. That said, if we look at the brands who were most exposed, and here we have in mind just kind of these heritage flagship American brands, we did see decreases in net purchase consideration of up to about 20 or 25 points. And these shifts were pretty similar across the markets that we looked at. And so what we think that suggests is if you are working with one of these flagship American companies, it's really identified with the country they come from, right? Their country of origin. We see pretty strong risk exposure on that front. if you're not so much associated with views of America in consumers' minds, the risk could be a little bit negligible. And in part, that's why we like to work with brands and partners just to get our country affinity metric in front of them to really help them quantify the relationship between these two things and what the risk exposure might look like. So looking forward to the European side of things, we would expect a similar thing to play out there. I'd say probably on average, not a massive hit to purchase consideration for kind of the average US brand. But again, if you are one of these larger American heritage brands, that's where we would see the largest risks.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Next question. If tensions over Greenland escalate, what specific signals and audiences should companies watch first?
I think that answer is pretty clear, and it's Europe. So if you remember that slide where you had the regional breakout, Europeans were paying a lot of attention even to Venezuela more than sort of Latin Americans. They were turning against the US. And then specifically with Greenland, of course, it directly affects Europe and the NATO alliance. And so what we've seen is just a very high level of awareness, as indicated by that sharp change right around those dates. And so companies that are really active among European consumers should be paying attention to US reputation in that region. But it goes beyond that, right? Because we also saw President Trump immediately threatening tariffs on Europe. And so if Greenland tensions were to escalate, I think it's not fully off the table that the United States might threaten tariffs again on Europe. And Europe was very prepared to use what it likes to call its trade bazooka back at the United States. Ironically, a tool that was initially developed to counter Chinese influence and what they call sort of bullying and trade, but that they indicated a willingness to use against the United States if the US tariffed them related to Greenland.
Great. Thanks, Sana. And more of sort of a specific one here, but we looked at country affinity by industry at one point during the conversation. A question here, are you able to analyze country affinity for individual brands as well?
Yes. So each of those white dots on that chart represented a brand, a specific brand. We can't do it for every brand. Some brands are only active in a single market. But to the extent that brands are active in multiple markets, that's how we sort of help them understand how tightly that relationship is trending between views of the United States and views of their brand. So if you've never talked about this with us and you're active in multiple markets, we would love to talk to you and understand how you're trying to think about this and see if we could help you.
Excellent. Thanks, Sonnet. Another question here in the chat. Are there industries where the impact of the negative sentiment on purchase consideration is high and others where it is low? And do you have a sense of what is contributing to that difference?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one, Cooper. So we looked into this again back in, I guess, February through April of 2025 when the US trade war first kicked off again. And essentially what we saw at that point in time was that it tended to be brands operating in consumer-facing industries that were really the most exposed. So not so much services, but really cases where you're selling a physical product to consumers. Often at the top of the list was food and beverage companies, where we saw fairly large hits, sometimes auto manufacturers, and then occasionally hotels. The other one that is a little bit more service oriented that we would typically see at the top of the list would be brands in the tech industry. So think social media or kind of just large US tech companies in general. America historically has just been viewed as a place that's an engine of innovation. And a lot of those recent innovations, whether we're talking about AI or social media, have really just traveled the world very fast. And so that was the one exception, still kind of consumer facing, but more on the services side relative to the physical goods side of things. And then just quickly, I know we had gotten another comment in there about what MENA countries were polled for the regional slides on the political risk sides of things specifically. And that line there includes Nigeria, Pakistan, Turkey, and South Africa. We do survey in other markets in the region. We survey in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, and in a few others as well. But those additional markets are not included in the risk line on that particular slide.
Excellent. Thanks, Jason. And I think there's one other question in here. Are there more opportunities for localized companies to grow in non-American markets?
Yeah, maybe I could take that. So what we've seen, taking Canada as an example, is that in places, unfortunately, for some of the US brands where there's a backlash against the United States, there's often a pivot towards local brands. So I think that's what this question is asking. And especially in sort of saturated markets where, to grow, you're trying to take market share. Unfortunately, this would be sort of a disadvantage to the US brand in that case, but an advantage to localized brands. And maybe I'll just briefly say this sort of country affinity idea is not inherently good or bad. So when I developed this, a couple of years ago, many brands were actually trying to up their country affinity with the United States because the U.S. generally has a great reputation overseas, for quality, for innovation. I mentioned some of those industries like technology that are really part of the US brand. So it's not inherently good or bad. It really depends on sort of if you're in a geopolitical crisis where the US is involved in a way that the local population is viewing negatively, then it becomes a liability. But in other cases, it could be an advantage. So that was a very insightful question.
I see also we have a short follow-up on the MENA stuff. And yes, you are correct. This would be better referred to as maybe MEA for Middle East and Africa. So apologies for the misnomer there, and let us get that updated for the future.
Excellent. And I think we have one more in here. What nuance and details can you share about the U.S. apparel industry's exposure in Europe and China? Um,
Yeah, on the apparel side of things, so again, because it's typically a consumer-facing industry, it's something we would expect there to be exposure to. Typically, what we've seen in the past, however, has been that it really varies brand by brand. So again, if you're one of these brands that's just recognized as being very American in some way, there we would expect there to be risks. One thing that might also be interesting to look into, depending on the market, could also be just kind of segmenting across luxury and non-luxury brands, where we know sometimes they're subject just to different economic pressures and different consumer mentalities in terms of why people buy into those segments or not. If you would like a read on your particular brand, please feel free to reach out to us after the fact, and we're happy to kind of dig in and give you a more holistic look at how you might be exposed. And then can layer on top of that what we're calling a new global market assessment that'll give you a look at some of the economics and political dynamics at play in the background. But long story short, it tends to vary a fair amount. So probably the safest option is to just come in for a read on your particular brand or company.
Excellent. Thanks, Jason. And I think that might be I think we've wrapped the key questions that have come in. That might be a nice sort of segue into some next steps. So one, we wanted to quickly flag that we have a new report that's come out, the year ahead in geopolitical risk, to help individuals and organizations understand how public sentiment surrounding these geopolitical issues that we've been discussing is trending, and ultimately how to help make corporate investment and policy decisions accordingly. So this report is coming out, and individuals can access it. And if there's any other interest or questions, I think we can pop forward one more slide. We'll be sending the report directly to you, but to Jason's point around apparel questions or other specific questions in relation to your brand or your industry, please feel free to reach out directly to our team. We've put in a little Zoom poll here to see how we can help, if folks would like to respond to that. But we are here. We are motivated and excited to support individuals as they make impactful decisions as quickly and effectively as possible in this rapidly changing environment. So thank you, everybody, for your time. Thank you, Sana and Jason, for the really valuable insights. And we look forward to seeing everybody on a future webinar.